Let me pray and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you for this day and for your blessings and for your faithfulness. I pray that you speak to me and through me. I want to be changed by your word, and I want to be a vehicle for you to speak through. And so I just pray that you would use these next few moments to help us learn a little bit more about you and what you have for us. Amen. All right. Well, so this week's message is going to be similar in kind of content as Pastor Howard's, my father-in-law's message last week. One of the challenges to, I guess, being a part of anything, being a part of a new business, having a new boss, being a part of a team, having a new coach, and certainly being a Christian, is at some point we have to submit to authority. And most of us don't love that, right? So for some it's easier. Some of those people who say it's easier to submit to authority, it's because they're just better at being sneaky. They're like, yeah, I totally submit to you. When we were student leaders at North Central, Michelle was with a group of people who I was the one when our boss would say, how do you feel about this new policy? I would say, that's dumb, but I'll do it. Michelle and her cohort would be like, I think it's great, and then not do it. So if you were here for last week's message, who's the good son? Me, right? So submission is hard, right? It's a hard thing to do. We don't like that. But it's actually an essential part to being a Christian. And so as I've mentioned over the past few, and that we've kind of been herky-jerky going through Matthew over the past few weeks. We're going to take a 4-week pause as we do the Family Feud series. So just by way of reminder, if last week's message and this one feel like it's kind of getting more intense, it is. Things are heating up as Jesus is heading towards, no one else knows that he's heading towards his crucifixion. The whole point of him being on earth, or not the whole point, but a big part of him being on earth. His messages, his tone, the teaching is getting kind of more intense. Also, just Michelle mentions happy birthday. 6 years ago, stop stammering, Jake. Hi. 6 years ago, we did 3 practice services, and then on this morning, church started at 9:30. We met downtown at the pump house, and we had a setup. I was on the setup team, right? And so we got up I think we just stayed up all night, right? It was just easier. So it's very early in the morning. It's pitch black in the house, and I'm coming down the house, and I'm excited. I'm nervous. I've never done this before. It's just, here it is. And I missed the last step and crashed as I'm getting up to go to our first official service as a church. So that's great. Similarly, 2 days ago, I watched TV wrong, and so my neck hurts. So if you see me kind of doing this and not turning my head much, that's why. I don't watch TV correctly anymore. So there you go. So that's it. I'm fine. It's just stupid. Yeah, you can give a snort for the guy, right? Just So that's again, birthday morning. There you go. Thank you. Birthday morning, birthday service morning. You want things to go right, and it's here we go. It just keep us humbled. Keep me humble. Okay. All that aside, let's get into this. Jesus is ramping things up. Things are getting more intense, and so we're going to go through a lot of chapter 22. Again, it's similar in message to what Pastor Howard talked about last week. That's what Matthew does. Much of his book is sections of teaching and then sections of story that kind of capture what he's just taught. And they go back and forth between this organization 5 times. A lot of what Matthew is doing is comparing Jesus to Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the bedrock of the Jewish faith. Matthew is making it clear Jesus supersedes Moses. Okay, so for us, we're like, yeah, that's easy enough to understand. Unless you're a big fan of the Old Testament, then it's like, well, I don't know, how does this work out? Matthew is making a major point just in the design, the organization of his book. So it's very poetic and very kind of beautifully done. So this is the kind of the story version of what we covered last week. Let's get into it. Matthew 22, 1 through 4. And again, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son, and sent his servants to call those who were invited to the wedding feast, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who are invited, see, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.'" This is a story. This is a word picture. These are done in a way to help the first audience understand, right? They would go, okay, I get that. Like, weddings are a big deal, and it's a huge production. If you've ever been to kind of a Middle Eastern, Asian wedding, these are big to-do, sometimes multi-day experiences, events, like hugely expensive, a big production. And so the audience would have said, okay, wedding, it's a big deal. It begins with the kingdom of heaven may be compared to this. And we kind of like that, right? We like parties here, right? So any excuse to kind of throw a party or have a kazoo, confetti, nope. But let's have a party, right? And so that's how this begins, is the kingdom of God kingdom of heaven can be compared to this. The king throws a party. It's kind of like saying the kingdom of heaven is kind of like this. And so we want to get doctrinal points from all of Jesus' teaching, but again, these are word pictures. The kingdom of heaven, where things are and the way things ought to be. It's like this. God's heart is to invite us to a feast, a party, to be with us in peace and to enjoy his and each other's company. That's the image, right? Heaven is like this. When everything is right, it's like this. It's a party. We're enjoying bounty and provision. In fact, the Mosaic Law calls for several feasts. These are images and reminders of how things were supposed to be. They're a reset. They do these throughout the year, and they're expected to do them because it helps us reconnect with God and remember who God is and who's in charge and how things are supposed to be. We do this in other ways. We have birthday services like this. You have an anniversary. Things are going tough, or things have kind of gotten stale and routine, and then your anniversary comes around, or your kid's birthday comes around, and you reconnect, right? You reset. This is built into how we live. Most of the Old Testament does not anticipate an ever after, a life after this life. Its emphasis is on ethics. It is connected to an understanding that God was only involved in life here and now. That's much of the Old Testament. In fact, the prolific understanding that there might be life after this was kind of just coming on the scene in a century or two before Jesus. This is a relatively new idea when he comes to earth. And that's kind of the way it was in ancient Near Eastern religions. You worship God, you did what you thought God wanted, and then if God was in a good mood, he would bless you for it, or at least not curse you. That's the hope. What's one of the unique things about Judaism is God's self-understanding of being just and loving. Ancient Near East gods weren't just and loving. Those weren't words that you would have connected to God. Gods then were more like superhumans, just kind of like almost like Greek gods or our superheroes. They're endowed with additional powers. They can do things. They live kind of heavenish, whatever, in the sky, but they're moody and temperamental and not really trustworthy, and certainly not known for being kind or loving or just. They're just simply to be appeased, not adored. So much of the Old Testament is this evolving understanding of God as loving and involved with daily life. God has ethical standards and expectations, but he's not unpredictable like he was to most ancient Near Eastern people. He's the constant. He's the North Star by which we can navigate our lives. Most of Matthew follows this Old Testament tradition of really being a book of ethics and morals. This is how you are to treat one another. That is most of what the Gospels are about. Most of what Jesus taught us about is how to live now. How to live like it's heaven here. But the end goal is that God wants to invite us to the party. And to do that, he sent prophets and teachers. They're the servants in this story. God's also revealed himself in creation. We often wonder, what about the people that haven't heard? Well, God makes it clear in the end of Job. His apologetic is, look at the world, look at creation. I made all this. Could you make all this? And the answer, of course, is no. Romans makes the same point. God has made every effort to share himself with his children. He wants people, all people. They're made in his image. They're all his kids, and he wants them all at the party. But this story was originally and specifically addressed to the Israelites. They're God's rescued and chosen people who had ignored and dismissed and turned their backs on and destroyed God's message and messengers. He invited them to his party, but they had other things in mind. The wedding is a special moment, right? You agonize over the guest list. You want the most special people there, friends and family who have been important to you throughout your life, people that you're proud of and who you want to make proud. It's the beginning of something new. And you want to share that with the most important people. Weddings are special moments. What's interesting about these really important special moments is they kind of happen every day. Yearly, there are 42 million weddings around the world, which makes them not very special and yet super special at the same time, right? It's this special thing that we get to share and other people get to experience. It's a wonderful moment. God wants us there for the special moments. Let's move on in chapter 22. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his servants and treated them shamefully and killed them. The king was angry and sent his troops and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, "The wedding feast is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main roads and invite to the wedding feast as many as you find." And those servants went out into the roads and gathered all whom they found, both bad and good. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. Again, this story is a parable version of what we looked at last week. The repetition, when we see things repeated, it sometimes is annoying. Us Westerners, we don't like that, right? It's a very Jewish way to communicate. But it should indicate to us, it should be one of those things like, okay, Jesus is saying the same thing in two different ways. Perhaps I should pay attention, right? He keeps repeating these kinds of themes. Maybe that's especially important. Everything he said was important, but the things he repeated kind of need to float to the top of our list a little bit. Like if I'm trying to understand Jesus, I start with those things, the things he said often. He repeats this, at least in Matthew's version, and Matthew tells us whether these stories, these experiences happened back to back doesn't matter. What matters that Matthew recognized that this was important teaching to Jesus, and he puts these two versions back to back so we have a moment to get it. Perhaps you're someone who understands this teaching better in the way it was covered last week, or perhaps the story helps, or you need both to make sense of it. Matthew is saying, pause a minute, pay attention. This is an indictment of how the Israelites had responded to God's effort to explain and share himself with them. They were meant to be the starting point, the beginning. Instead of gratefulness and faithfulness, they took for granted that they deserved it, that it was just for them, that there would always be time. They decided to cut and paste the message, to choose what parts they liked and what parts they didn't. So prophets were ignored, prophets were imprisoned, prophets were killed. The whole point, starting with Abraham, was that the Israelites would be a light to the world, and that the world would hear of Yahweh and Yahweh's justice and love through them. So sending his faithful back out into the streets to find people who do want to come to the party is not contrary to God's original objective. Instead, it's plan B or C or maybe plan A too. It's what God intended all along. It just the starting point has changed. Because God will do his will whether we partner with him or not. Sometimes we can get arrogant. God needs me to do this thing. God cannot do his will unless I do it for him, unless I make it happen. That is not the story. That is not the plan. That is not what's best. What's best is when we submit ourselves to his plan and get to go along for the ride. The Gospels are full of stories of outsiders coming to faith, and the New Testament is the account of mostly non-Jewish people coming to faith. God will build his church because the church, the gathering of believers, us, we're the evidence of his ability to change lives. Each one of us can be a story, can be an apologetic, can be evidence and proof. God does amazing things. Let me tell you that story. I don't have to worry about being smart and being able to argue for our faith. When we argue for our faith, we often reduce it to something that's so defensible but almost meaningless and heartless it doesn't really help. In the end, let me tell you a story about where I was headed and where I'm headed now because of Jesus. Well, I don't know if I believe that. That's okay, because I do. I'm grateful. I'm thankful. Let me tell you that story. We are his big idea, his plan. The evidence of changed lives and his way of drawing more people to his party. It's us. But this warning isn't just for the Israelites, it's for us too. We need to read and try our best to understand the stories in the teaching as it would have been understood by its original audience. But as old as I'm getting, and as sore as my neck is, I was not around 2,000 years ago, right? Not quite, just missed it. And so we don't know exactly what it would have been like. We can try, our scholars help us for sure, but we do our best to understand what did this mean then to them, and then what does it mean for us now. So after trying to understand, we put ourselves in the story and ask, would Jesus say the same kinds of things to me? To us. I was talking with a pastor friend of mine who was a couple years ago, this guy in his church, guy who I don't know who the guy is. A little bit older than me, I know that much. And this man said, I wish you talked more about politics. He said, well, you're going to love it. This summer, so this would have been summer 24, we're going to go through the Sermon on the Mount. We really think that's going to help prepare us to think about the elections and think about how we should treat our fellow humans. And the man's response was, he's a Christian man, goes to church. That worked in the first century, but it doesn't work now. So, the greatest sermon ever, given by the greatest teacher ever, is irrelevant. Doesn't do the job now. Well, the whole sermon is about, in the kingdom, it's like this. This is the way it is, and the way in heaven, and the way it should be now. My job is not to judge that man's heart. But there's a tremendous lack of submission in that statement, right? And I have to, now, it's fun in my heart to take pot shots at that guy. Like, how bad is that? But I have to put myself in that story. Are there parts of Jesus' teaching, Jesus' way of life, parts of the kingdom of heaven where I'm supposed to be a citizen, right? Like, I'm not really a citizen of the U.S. temporarily, but my real citizenship, my real home, the reason why things just don't feel quite right here is because they won't be quite right, because I am a foreigner. If you ever lived overseas or known people who lived overseas, they might be Americans. They serve sometimes not that long, 6 months, a year in another country. They come back here and they're kind of lost. They're like, I'm not really American anymore. I'm also not really Chinese or wherever they serve, but they've begun to become third culture people is what it's called. They're kind of in between. We should feel that way, right? This is not my home. So I need to put myself in this story, though, and ask, okay, what parts of Jesus' teaching and Jesus' life have I said that worked then, but doesn't work now, or it's irrelevant? There's lots I don't relate to because, again, I didn't live then, so I've got to try to figure it out. And Jesus is merciful, graceful to bring us along. I'm going to use an analogy from my own life that might irk some of you, and I guess we'll have to deal with that. But so I'm not making a political statement. I'm just telling you what I see and what I've experienced. I used to have the hardest time. I became a Christian. I was late in high school, heading into my junior year, from the upper Midwest. My experience with guns is pretty minimal. I got a 22 rifle when I was 12. I've shot maybe 50 bullets out of it, not very many. My father-in-law has been housing it since we met, I think, so over 30 years. I don't know how often I've actually had this in my possession. I got my first BB gun when I was 17 and my great-grandmother died. So, and I still have that. You can see the BB's just, it's weak. But I understood Scripture and Christianity a certain way. And then I was doing this thing for a while. I began to hear about like the Anabaptists and these passive Christians who are pacifists, anti-war, whatever. And I was like, that's terrible. I don't understand that. I didn't relate to that. And then I had to recognize and wrestle with Jesus, whom we follow, who has all the angels at his command, died at the hands of his enemies. And that was the big solution to the world's pain. I'm not making an anti-military statement. I'm saying that I have to accept that about Jesus, and I have to ask what that means for me. And it took me a long time to even be open to the question. That's an example from my own life. We have to ask the question. In countries like ours that have so identified with one faith for so long, there's certainly overlap. Everywhere God has revealed himself in culture. Everywhere, right? And there are parts of every culture that will be in heaven, but not all of any culture, right? Heaven will not look like Wisconsin. Maybe a little bit. Oh, right? But not, I don't think the world's biggest six-pack will make it to heaven. Maybe. Hopefully not the smell from the world's biggest six-pack. So that means that parts of what we have here are pretty close, and lots of what we have here are pretty far away from what God has. But what happens is when we see things like this is what God has for us in Christianity and the kingdom of heaven, and this is our country, and they overlap a little bit, we spend our time in the overlap, then we replace one for the other. So if parts of my culture are similar to Christianity, then all of my culture is accepted. And that is not a good Christian mindset. We need to ask questions. What parts of my culture do not fit in with Jesus, don't resemble Jesus? What parts of my own heart? What I'm saying is, BB guns aside, there are probably every one of us has something about Jesus that we just, and what it means to follow Jesus, that we just don't like. That's okay. That's right. He's radically different from us. And so there's some parts of him that are going to rub us the wrong way. But we're called to submit. We're called to learn Jesus, to understand Jesus. We have to ask hard questions. To reject the parts we don't like is to reject Jesus. And then we are saying we don't want a part in the kingdom. We don't want to go to the party. And we can have kind of like Christian-y ethics, but those only get us so far, right? We have to ask hard questions. Every believer worldwide must, and we must see ourselves as citizens of heaven and parts of a global society. For instance, the Russian Orthodox Church is totally fine with and supportive of the attack on Ukraine. The Ukrainian church thinks it's not Christian. What should Christians think about that? What does Jesus think about that? It can't be that Jesus is okay with it for Russia and not okay with it for Ukraine. That splits Jesus into too many parts, too many personalities. So what is the right thing? What is the responsibility of a Christian? We have to ask these tough questions and submit ourselves to the best of our ability, knowing that we are going to get it wrong. No one grows in any way, in any parts of our life. Growth does not happen on a continuous upward trajectory. There are fits and starts. We kind of, right? You watch babies and they like can't do anything for themselves, and then they're like arch their back. Like, look at that, all right? Isaac was born, and for the first 24 hours, was like, look at this thing. He's got his hand up in the air. What? Right? And then he was exhausted for the next week. So the kid can't do anything, and then they figure out how to roll over. And they do that like it's a sport, right? And then they figure that out for a while, right? It's all in fits and starts, right? We grow, kind of plateau, figure out something new. It can happen in our faith too. We're going to grow, we're going to understand something, and then we're going to misunderstand something, but is this trajectory towards submission? Jesus understands that. We move towards him. He gives us instructions on how to live, like how to treat our neighbors and people not like us, how to give our time and money. Those can be hard, right? How to pray and fast. Fasting's a bummer. How to make judgment calls and stay humble. I was talking to some people recently who are having to make some tough decisions and trying to figure out what is their authority in that space. And if you've ever been in a position of authority, it can kind of mess with your head, right? And so I cautioned, you have to stay humble. You have to find a way to stay humble as your authority increases. The more authority you have, the more opportunity you have to really hurt someone. So be humbled by this. Don't take it for granted. He's been teaching us about how to relegate significance and rank and prioritize serving, prioritize the other. These are parts of the abundant life, the life that is rich and full. They are some of what God has given us to help us be more like him, so the world can see him in us, so more people can come to the party. We must choose, he's saying. In his grace and mercy, God invites us again and again, but we must choose. This last part of the passage is a tough one, verses 11 through 14. But when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." If this feels a little out of place, you're not alone. I looked at multiple commentaries about this, and most of them are saying, we aren't really sure what's going on here. Right? Some have tried to allegorize to figure out what he means by this. There's no known wedding garment. Be helpful, right, to know what that means so we could understand what Jesus is saying. Some have then theorized that maybe this was added later and doesn't belong there, but most scholars have said, no, we think it belongs there. We just don't know for sure what it means. And that's always fun when you're trying to prepare for a message on a birthday service, when you're like, I don't know, go in peace, right? And submit to whatever this means. Let me know if you figure it out. Here's what we know. The king came in. The Bible is nothing if not a story of God coming to us. It's a missionary story. God coming to us. God reaching out to us. God sharing himself with us. We don't have to chase him and hope that he's in a good mood. Like our ancient Near East brothers and sisters, fellow humans that were just trying to figure God out. We don't have to do that. God comes to us. That's the story over and over again. He is reaching out to us. He's extending an invitation to us. God came in. The king came. He's not distant and disinterested in your life or, as we prayed this morning, the life of this nation. He sees you. He knows when we're sincerely following him, and he knows when we're going through the motions. He knows when our religion, our faith practice comes from a place of love and devotion, and when it comes from a place of convenience and affiliation. He knows that. Now, the last verse says, "For many are called, but few are chosen." The word called is often translated invited. I don't think there's any other doctrinal point here other than mimicking what it says in John 3:17. In another way, he's saying what he says in John 3:17. For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world, the whole world, everyone, might be saved through him. His heart is for his children to come to him, to live the abundant life now. And the more people living the abundant life now, the less pain there is in our neighbors' homes, in our communities, in our nations, between nations. The more heaven touches earth, and heaven touches earth through us, the more that happens, the more peace, more justice. I think this fits in with other passages we've discussed that describe people who started well and then went astray or got it wrong. Putting the stories together, I think we are being cautioned to submit to Jesus. When you look at what Pastor Howard talked about last week and what he's saying here now and what Jesus has been leading us to through this whole gospel. This is what I have for you. Submit to this. Live this way. Even the uncomfortable bits that rub us the wrong way, submit to Jesus. We have to submit to him. Other versions of Jesus we've come across, and submit our worldview, our political party, our family upbringing, science, philosophy, or whatever to him, and view those things through the lens of Jesus, not Jesus through the lens of those things. Jesus is the creator of... Now, we can't completely do that because we were raised where we were raised, in the family we were raised, and we had the third grade teacher we had, and all that stuff. We can't erase who we are, but we do our best. Lord, help me to understand you as you are. He is the creator of all things, so we should start with him. We go to the beginning, and we return to him. This last bit is a hard end to a warm story, but it reflects Jesus' love for us. We have to remember that the hard bits that Jesus said are also Jesus' heart. They're also the truth. About 100 years ago, when Dave was a young man, and when he was in chapel, at the college that he attended and I worked at, I preached a message, and I just went through the Gospels, and I started with the easy things Jesus said, the things that are nice, and then got to some of the hard things, and I just kept saying, Jesus said some things, and I think he meant them. So we have to submit to this part too, even though we don't fully understand it, right? Jesus, what do you have for me? We know this is a warning. But we know the king came to give the warning because the king loves us. He loves everyone because everyone is made in his image. And I have to submit myself to that as well as I interact with people I maybe would rather not. They're an image bearer too. I wish they weren't. Right? We all have those people, if we're honest. We're going to sing Build My Life. And then we're going to celebrate our 6th birthday. And as I was preparing this, Matthew has pretty much told me what is coming up next. And sometimes the timing of messages feels like it doesn't fit the moment. This is a heavy message, been a heavy couple of messages. But we want what Jesus has for us because he loves us and he knows what's best for us. It's been 6 good years, which mean there have been challenges and trials and mercies and graces. And I'm grateful that I and we are accepting Jesus' invitation to the party. Worship team, if you want to come up. But I know myself and I know ourselves enough to know that Jesus is right. Sometimes we can get it wrong. And sometimes we can mess it up. Sanctification is the process of becoming more like Jesus, and it's not a steady upward trajectory. Sometimes we get off course entirely. Fortunately, gracefully, we're given opportunity to try again. And we are reminders to ourselves and each other that while we are not called to live in fear, we do also need to be attentive and intentional, following Jesus' rule of life. We do this individually and corporately. We help each other in this process. This isn't meant to be a bunch of islands, right? An archipelago. How's that? We do this together. As we celebrate year 6 and we look to year 7, let's sing this song for ourselves and for our church. Let's build and rebuild our lives on Jesus, the cornerstone. I'm going to show you the mission statement. Do I have a slide? Yeah, there we go. At Bluffs Community Church, we believe Jesus is the center of all things, and he invites us to make him the center of our lives. We come together with questions and imperfections to experience life and faith, and we share the love and hope of Jesus with the world around us. Honest, sacred together is our tagline. Jesus knows this is hard. That's why he came when he did. That's why he taught us. Why he came himself to teach us the way, right? Taught it to a bunch of knuckleheads that got it wrong and got it right and got confused, and now we're those knuckleheads. Yeah? We want to do this. We want this church to be around, until Jesus comes back, long after us. Michelle has said that multiple times. The idea that we could start something that lives way beyond us, right? We want this to be a place where we can come together and say, Jesus, I don't like that, but I trust you. Ish, maybe, right? Let's be honest. Sometimes it's an ish. I want to trust you. Help me to follow you. Help me to represent you. Help us to be that place where we can come and be honest about those things that we're struggling with, the things that we don't like, the things that don't make sense. There's a lot of things about the Bible that don't make sense. Sometimes they come in and out of sense to me. Sometimes I get something, and then the next time I read it, I'm like, what? Right? It's a journey for us. He gives us, imperfect people, fallen people, each other, to help point each other to Jesus, right? To submit to Jesus, even the bits we don't like. So we can say and we can partner with him as he builds his kingdom here so this place can look more like heaven tomorrow than it does today. So when we sing Build My Life, let's sing it with ourselves and all of us in mind. Can we stand?